In the spring of 2011, a 29-year-old electrician named Daniel Sorensen sat on the floor of his father's garage in Maple Grove, Indiana, holding a thin, spiral-bound booklet he hadn't opened in 19 years. Outside, the first warm afternoon of the season had drawn most of the neighborhood out onto porches and lawns, and Daniel could hear a lawnmower running somewhere down the block, an ordinary springtime sound that made the strange, cold weight settling into his chest feel even more disorienting by contrast. His wife was 7 months pregnant with their first child, and Daniel had come over that weekend specifically to dig through his own childhood belongings, looking for anything worth saving, for a baby who didn't exist yet, but who already, in some strange way, seemed to be pulling pieces of Daniel's own forgotten past back up to the surface. The booklet was a 5th-grade memory book, the kind elementary schools across the country handed out at the end of every school year in the early 1990s, filled with handwritten notes from classmates, a class photo, and a single page near the back, where each student had been asked to write about their favorite memory of the school year. Daniel flipped past his classmates' looping, uneven signatures, past a drawing of a dinosaur someone named Kyle had contributed for no apparent reason, and stopped on his own page, where a 10-year-old version of himself had written 6 sentences in careful, deliberate pencil that made the grown man's hands go cold the moment he actually read them again for the first time in nearly 2 decades. What those 6 sentences described, and what an entire town had spent 19 years failing to connect to the disappearance of a beloved young teacher named Jennifer Hale, would finally answer a question that had haunted Maple Grove since the night of October 13th, 1992, when Mrs. Hale walked out of Maple Grove Elementary School after parent-teacher night and was never seen alive again, to understand why a forgotten sentence in a child's memory book could matter so much. 19 years later, you first have to understand what kind of town Maple Grove was in 1992 and what kind of teacher Jennifer Hale had been. Maple Grove sat in the rolling farmland of southern Indiana, a town of just under 6,000 people built around a courthouse square, a main street with a hardware store and a 5 and dime, and Maple Grove Elementary, a squat brick building from the 1950s that educated nearly every child in town from kindergarten through 6th grade. The town itself had the particular rhythm of every small Midwestern county seat, a Friday night football schedule that half the population attended, regardless of whether they had a child on the team, a 4th of July parade down Main Street that had run without interruptions since before anyone living could remember its actual beginning, and a courthouse square lined with the same handful of family-owned businesses that had occupied those storefronts for generations. Everyone in Maple Grove either knew Jennifer Hale personally or knew someone who did, a degree of familiarity that made her disappearance feel, to nearly every resident, less like a news story and more like a wound that had opened directly inside their own household. Jennifer Hale, 28 years old that fall, had grown up in Maple Grove herself, graduated from Maple Grove High School, gone away to Indiana State University to earn her teaching degree, and had returned home in 1986, specifically to teach at the same elementary school where she herself had once been a student, a decision her own mother, Carol Whitmore, always said felt less like a career choice and more like Jennifer simply going home to where she belonged. Carol herself had worked for over 20 years as a bookkeeper at the local grain elevator, widowed when Jennifer was only 14 after her husband, Jennifer's father, died suddenly of a heart attack while repairing a fence on the family's small property outside town, an event that had left mother and daughter unusually close, the kind of closeness where mother and daughter spoke on the phone nearly every single evening, regardless of how uneventful the day had been. Jennifer's younger sister, Diane Whitmore, 2 years her junior, had moved to Indianapolis after high school and built a career there in accounting, visiting Maple Grove only for holidays and special occasions, a physical distance that never once diminished the closeness between the sisters, who spoke by phone with the same near-daily regularity Jennifer maintained with their mother. Diane would later say that the last conversation she ever had with her sister, a phone call on the Sunday before parent-teacher night, had been entirely about nursery colors and whether yellow or a soft sage green would suit the baby better, regardless of whether it turned out to be a boy or a girl, a conversation so completely, achingly ordinary that Diane found herself replaying it in her mind for years afterward, unable to accept that it had turned out to be the last one. By 1992, Jennifer had been teaching 5th grade at Maple Grove Elementary for 6 years and had become, in the way certain teachers do in small towns, something close to a local institution, the kind of teacher parents specifically requested for their children, the kind whose classroom door was always covered in construction paper decorations that changed with every season. She had married Tom Hale, a local electrician 3 years older than her, in 1989, and the two had bought a small house on Birchwood Lane, just 4 blocks from the school, close enough that Jennifer often walked to work on mild mornings. Tom and Jennifer had met at a church picnic in 1987, and by every account given by friends and family, theirs was the kind of relationship that seemed, from the very beginning, entirely uncomplicated, built on the same easy, unhurried affection that characterized most long marriages in Maple Grove, rather than any dramatic courtship. Tom's own parents lived just 4 blocks away on the other side of the school, close enough that Sunday dinners rotated between the two households almost weekly, and Tom's younger brother, Curtis, worked alongside him in the small electrical contracting business the two had built together over the previous several years. In the spring of 1992, Jennifer and Tom learned she was pregnant with their first child, a piece of news that swept through Maple Grove almost as quickly as it swept through the Hale family itself, since half the town seemed to feel a personal stake in the happiness of a teacher so many of them had watched grow up. Jennifer had, by her own admission to friends, struggled somewhat in the earliest months of the pregnancy, with morning sickness severe enough that she had needed a substitute for 2 full days in April. But by October, she had entered what she cheerfully described to her fellow teachers as the easiest, most enjoyable stretch of the entire experience, energetic, glowing, and thoroughly enjoying the steady stream of gifts and unsolicited advice that seemed to follow a visibly pregnant teacher through the hallways of an elementary school. By October of that year, Jennifer was 5 months along, visibly pregnant, and had spent the first weeks of the school year good-naturedly fielding an endless stream of questions from her 5th graders about names, nursery colors, and whether the baby would grow up to be as smart as she was. She and Tom had already settled, privately, on the name Grace if the baby turned out to be a girl, a detail Jennifer had shared only with her mother and her sister, wanting to keep at least one small secret between the 3 of them a little while longer before announcing it to the rest of the family. Parent-teacher night at Maple Grove Elementary that October was held on a Tuesday evening, scheduled from 5:30 until 8:30, with teachers meeting parents in 15-minute blocks in their own classrooms, while the school's administrative staff kept a sign-in sheet at the front entrance and a rough schedule board in the main hallway, showing which conferences were running on time and which had fallen behind. Jennifer's schedule that evening was, by every account given afterward, fully booked, 12 separate 15-minute conferences stretching across the full 3 hours, covering everything from proud updates about star students to more difficult conversations about children who were struggling. One of those more difficult conversations, scheduled for 7:15, was with a father named Roger Kessler, whose son Danny Kessler was that fall, at serious risk of being held back a grade due to failing marks in both reading and math. Roger Kessler was, in the assessment of nearly every teacher and administrator who had dealt with him over the years, a difficult man, prone to sudden flashes of temper that had already resulted in 2 separate incidents at the school in previous years, including one shouting match with a 3rd-grade teacher 2 years earlier that had required the principal to personally intervene. He worked at a grain processing plant 20 minutes outside of town, operating heavy machinery on the overnight and swing shifts, work that left him chronically exhausted and, according to more than one former co-worker, increasingly short-tempered as the years wore on. He had gone through a divorce in 1990 that left him raising his son largely alone during the school week, his ex-wife having moved to Ohio with a new partner and taking custody only during summer months, an arrangement that left Roger simultaneously overwhelmed by single parenthood and resentful of a situation he felt he'd never fully chosen for himself. He carried, by his own admission to Jennifer during that October conference, an enormous amount of guilt and frustration about his son's struggles in school, guilt he tended to express as anger rather than sadness, a pattern several of his co-workers would later describe as consistent with how he handled nearly every difficult emotion in his life. His son, Danny Kessler, was by all accounts a quiet, anxious 10-year-old who struggled significantly with reading comprehension, a difficulty that had gone largely unaddressed through 3rd and 4th grade, before finally becoming impossible to ignore in Jennifer's 5th grade classroom, where the academic demands increased sharply. Jennifer had, in fact, already recommended the boy for additional testing to determine whether he might have an undiagnosed learning difference, a recommendation that Roger, according to Jennifer's own notes preserved in the school's files, had initially resisted, viewing it as a suggestion that something was fundamentally wrong with his son, rather than a possible explanation and pathway toward help. The October conference had been specifically scheduled to discuss the testing recommendation and the very real possibility that Danny Kessler would need to repeat the 5th grade if his reading skills did not improve substantially before the end of the year. News that Jennifer had known, going in, was likely to be difficult for Roger to hear calmly. The conference between Jennifer and Roger Kessler that evening, according to 2 other parents who were waiting in the hallway outside her classroom for their own scheduled slots, grew loud enough to be heard clearly through the closed door, Roger's voice rising sharply at one point to accuse Jennifer of giving up on his son, of failing to understand what the boy was going through at home, while Jennifer's voice remained calm and measured throughout, repeating, according to one witness, some version of the same sentence several times. "I understand you're frustrated, Mr. Kessler, but I need you to lower your voice." One of the waiting parents, a woman named Sandra Whitlock, whose own conference was scheduled directly after Kessler's, later told police she distinctly heard Roger say, near the end of the meeting, that Jennifer had no idea what real pressure looked like, a comment Sandra found strange enough at the time to mention to her husband on the drive home that same night, well before anyone in Maple Grove had any reason to believe the comment might carry any darker significance. Sandra herself went in for her own conference immediately after Kessler stormed out, and told investigators in 1992 that Jennifer had seemed rattled but composed, taking a moment to straighten a stack of papers on her desk before greeting Sandra with her usual warm smile, apologizing for the delay, and joking, in a small aside, Sandra never forgot, that she supposed she would need to get used to difficult conversations now that she was going to be raising a strong-willed child of her own. Sandra would spend the following 19 years occasionally wondering whether she should have said something more forceful to police at the time about how shaken Jennifer had genuinely seemed, though she, like nearly everyone else involved in the original investigation, had no way of knowing that the argument itself was not, in fact, fully over. The conference ended at 7:30, 10 minutes over its scheduled slot, and Roger Kessler left Jennifer's classroom without speaking to the parents waiting outside, walking quickly down the main hallway toward the front entrance. The sign-out sheet at the front desk, maintained by a parent volunteer that evening, recorded Roger Kessler signing out at 7:34, a full hour before parent-teacher night officially ended, a detail that would come to matter enormously 19 years later, though almost nobody paid it any particular attention at the time beyond a passing comment among the waiting parents about how relieved they were not to be married to a man with a temper like that. What almost nobody in the building that evening knew, because there had been no particular reason for anyone to notice or remark on it, was that a 10-year-old boy named Danny Sorensen was sitting quietly on a bench in the main hallway for nearly the entire evening, waiting for his own father. Danny's father, Frank Sorensen, worked the evening shift at a factory 40 minutes away and had specifically requested the very last conference slot of the night, 8:15, since it was the only time he could arrange to leave work early enough to attend at all. Frank had been raising Danny alone since his wife's death from cancer 3 years earlier, and the two had developed, out of simple necessity, a close, self-reliant partnership that meant Danny spent countless evenings entertaining himself in waiting rooms, break rooms, and on this particular night, the main hallway of Maple Grove Elementary, while his father finished long shifts. Rather than have Danny sit alone at home for 3 hours, Frank had simply brought his son with him straight from school, and Danny, a quiet, self-sufficient boy, well used to entertaining himself while his father worked long hours, had settled onto the hallway bench outside the school library, with a stack of comic books and a bag of pretzels, content to wait out the evening watching the parade of families come and go from classroom to classroom. Danny occupied himself for the first hour or so simply reading, occasionally looking up to watch familiar faces from his own class pass by with their parents, some of them grinning about good report cards, others looking distinctly less cheerful. Around 7:30, bored of his comic books, he wandered the halls a bit, careful to stay within the general area where his father had told him to remain, poking his head briefly into the gymnasium where the PTA had set up a small bake sale table, buying a brownie with change he'd found in his jacket pocket, before eventually settling near the side entrance window overlooking the teacher's parking lot, drawn there mostly by the simple boredom of a 10-year-old with nothing better to do and a large window offering a view of something, anything, happening outside. Danny would later tell Detective Rachel Voss, in a conversation that took place 19 years after that October evening, that he had grown genuinely bored by around 8 o'clock and had wandered from his bench toward the side entrance near the gymnasium, where a window looked out over the smaller side parking lot the teachers used, a lot separate from the main visitor lot at the front of the school. Danny had been watching the parking lot idly, killing time, when he saw Mrs. Hale, recognizable immediately in her bright yellow maternity blouse, walk out of the side door and across the lot toward her own car, a light blue sedan parked near the far end. A man was waiting near her car when she arrived, standing beside a red pickup truck parked in the next space over. Danny could not hear anything through the closed window and the distance, but he watched Mrs. Hale stop several feet from the man, her posture stiffening in a way that struck even a 10-year-old boy as different from her usual, easy, relaxed manner. The two of them spoke for what Danny estimated, in his later account, to be somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes, Mrs. Hale gesturing at one point with both hands, in a way that looked, to Danny, like she was trying to explain something or push back against whatever the man was saying. He did not recognize the man from that distance, and in that light, though he would later tell Detective Voss that something about his build and the way he stood reminded him, only vaguely and only in hindsight, of a man he'd seen shouting at another parent in the school parking lot once before, though he couldn't say for certain it was the same person. Before Danny could see how the conversation ended, a member of the school's custodial staff, a man named Wendell Price, who had worked at Maple Grove Elementary for over 20 years, and who knew nearly every child in the building by name after 2 decades of watching them grow up year after year, found Danny at the window and told him his father had just signed in for the 8:15 slot and was looking for him, and Danny, being 10 years old and having lost interest in the scene outside, the moment something more immediately relevant came up, simply walked away from the window and went to find his father, never once looking back to see what happened next in that parking lot. Wendell himself, when interviewed briefly by police in 1992 as part of the general staff canvass, mentioned only that he had been locking up the gymnasium and the side entrance around that time, and had noticed Jennifer's car still in the lot, a detail considered unremarkable at the time, since several teachers routinely stayed late finishing paperwork after parent-teacher night. Nobody in 1992 ever asked Wendell whether he had personally seen a young boy near that same window, and Wendell, who retired in 1999 and passed away in 2007, 4 years before the case was finally solved, never had reason to connect his own small, unremarkable memory of a bored child at a window to anything significant at all. It would be 19 years before anyone, including Danny himself, understood the significance of what he had just seen and then simply walked away from. Frank Sorensen's conference ran until nearly 8:40, past the school's official end time for the evening, and by the time Danny and his father left the building, the parking lot Danny had been watching earlier was empty, the light blue sedan and the red pickup truck both long gone. Neither Danny nor his father thought anything more about the evening at all until the following morning, when Jennifer Hale failed to arrive at Maple Grove Elementary for the first time in her 6 years of teaching there. Tom Hale woke on the morning of October 14th to find his wife's side of the bed empty, and assumed, at first, that Jennifer had simply gotten up early, a common enough habit for her in the final months of pregnancy, when comfortable sleep had become increasingly difficult to find. He lay there for several minutes, listening for the sound of her moving around downstairs, the particular creak of the 3rd step that always gave away when someone was in the kitchen, and when he heard nothing at all, a small, easily dismissed flicker of unease passed through him before he told himself she had probably just gone for an early walk, something Jennifer had taken to doing several mornings a week that fall on the recommendation of her doctor. It was only when he came downstairs and found the kitchen exactly as it had been the night before. No coffee made, no sign that Jennifer had eaten breakfast or left for school, that a slow, creeping unease began to settle over him. He called the school at 7:45, and the front office confirmed that Jennifer had not yet arrived, unusual for a teacher who was, by every account, almost pathologically punctual, having not missed a single day of work due to lateness in her entire 6 years of teaching. He called her own parents, and then, receiving no answer and no useful information from anyone, drove to the school himself, arriving to find Jennifer's light blue sedan still parked in the exact spot in the side lot where she had left it the previous evening, doors locked, keys nowhere to be found, her purse still sitting on the passenger seat with her wallet, her identification, and $40 in cash completely untouched inside. Principal Harold Beck, who unlocked the car himself with a spare key kept in the school office for exactly this kind of emergency, would later describe the moment he saw Jennifer's purse sitting undisturbed on the passenger seat as the instant he understood, with total certainty, that something had happened to her that had nothing to do with her own choice, since no woman 5 months pregnant simply walks away from her car, her identification, and her cash without a single one of those things, unless something has gone terribly wrong. The Maple Grove Police Department, a department of 9 officers responsible for a town of 6,000 people, began treating the case as an active missing persons investigation within the hour, a decision made easier and more urgent by the simple, devastating fact that Jennifer Hale was 5 months pregnant. Chief Robert Aldridge, a career officer who had spent most of his 18 years on the force dealing with minor property crimes and the occasional domestic disturbance, found himself, for the first time in his professional life, coordinating a search for a beloved local teacher who appeared to have vanished from a school parking lot sometime in the 3-hour window between when parents last remembered seeing her at parent-teacher night and when her husband discovered her car untouched the following morning. The investigation that followed, over the first days and weeks, moved through the same painfully familiar stages that define nearly every disappearance of this kind. Every parent who had attended a conference with Jennifer that evening was interviewed, and the interviews quickly surfaced the loud, contentious meeting with Roger Kessler, a detail that made Chief Aldridge's investigators sit up immediately given Kessler's known history of temper and his previous incidents at the school. Kessler was brought in for formal questioning within 48 hours, and though he admitted freely and somewhat defensively to the argument, insisting he had simply been an overwhelmed, frustrated father defending his son, he produced the sign-out sheet showing he had left the building at 7:34, a full hour before anyone believed Jennifer had actually disappeared, since the last confirmed sighting of her by any adult witness placed her still inside the building, attending to later conferences, well past 8 o'clock. 2 co-workers at the grain processing plant, when contacted, confirmed that Kessler had called them from a payphone near his home at approximately 8:15 that evening to complain at length and in colorful language about how the parent-teacher conference had gone, a call both co-workers separately and consistently placed at that specific time because it interrupted a television program they'd been watching together. On the strength of the sign-out sheet and the corroborated phone call, Chief Aldridge cleared Roger Kessler as a serious suspect within the first week, redirecting the department's limited investigative resources toward other avenues. Other avenues, in the weeks that followed, proved almost entirely fruitless. A traveling insurance salesman who had been seen in the area 2 days before Jennifer's disappearance was tracked down and cleared through verified whereabouts 300 miles away. A former student's older brother, briefly rumored around town to have harbored an inappropriate infatuation with Jennifer during his own time as her student years earlier, was interviewed and found to have a solid alibi involving a college exam the following morning that made the entire theory collapse almost immediately. The Indiana State Police assisted with additional canvassing of the surrounding rural roads and farmland, and a K-9 unit brought in from the county sheriff's department picked up Jennifer's scent in the school parking lot and lost it entirely at the edge of the pavement, exactly the kind of maddeningly abrupt trail loss that suggested, without proving, that she had gotten into a vehicle. Tom Hale, as is almost universally true in cases involving a missing pregnant wife, found himself under quiet but persistent suspicion for months, an experience he would later describe as its own particular kind of hell, layered directly on top of the unbearable grief of simply not knowing where his wife and unborn child had gone. Investigators examined the couple's finances, their marriage, any history of conflict between them, and found, by every measure available to a small-town police department in 1992, absolutely nothing to suggest Tom had any involvement at all. His alibi for the hours in question, having been at his own family's house 4 blocks away, helping his elderly father repair a leaking roof gutter, an activity witnessed and confirmed by his father, his brother Curtis, and a neighbor who had stopped by to borrow a ladder, was airtight from the very beginning. Chief Aldridge cleared him formally within the first month, but the quiet suspicion that clings to a husband in cases like this, whispered in grocery store aisles and church pews, regardless of any official clearance, followed Tom Hale through Maple Grove for years afterward, a burden he carried in addition to his own grief that many in town never fully understood or acknowledged. Tom would later describe overhearing at the grocery store nearly 2 years after Jennifer disappeared, a stranger telling a untouched friend that they'd always heard it was probably the husband, a comment that sent Tom out to his truck in the parking lot to sit alone for nearly 20 minutes before he could compose himself enough to drive home. The search itself, conducted across the fields and woodlands surrounding Maple Grove over the following weeks, turned up nothing. Volunteers walked the banks of Sugar Creek, which ran along the eastern edge of town, for 3 consecutive weekends, wading through cold October water in waders borrowed from the local sporting goods store, checking culverts and drainage pipes for any sign of disturbance. Search teams walked the harvested cornfields surrounding the school in careful grid patterns, a task made slower and more difficult by the sheer scale of farmland surrounding a town like Maple Grove. Tips poured in over the following months from as far away as Illinois and Kentucky, each one investigated and each one, eventually, leading nowhere. A woman in Louisville reported seeing a pregnant woman matching Jennifer's description at a bus station. A lead, Chief Aldridge, personally drove 3 hours to investigate before discovering the woman in question was, in fact, an entirely unrelated expectant mother traveling to visit family. By the time the leaves fell that November, the same slow, quiet transformation that eventually overtakes every unsolved disappearance had begun to settle over Maple Grove. Fewer volunteers, fewer headlines, and an ever-deepening ache in a town that had lost one of its own without ever learning why. Carol Whitmore, Jennifer's mother, kept a room in her own house ready for the grandchild who would never arrive, a small crib assembled and never used, sitting untouched in the corner of what had once been Jennifer's own childhood bedroom, for reasons Carol herself could never fully explain even to close friends, beyond a quiet, stubborn refusal to accept that hope was no longer warranted. She wrote to the Indiana State Police every single year on the anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance, asking whether any new forensic technology might be applied to the case, and received, for nearly 2 decades, the same gentle, unchanging response. The case remains open, but there are no new leads to pursue. Chief Robert Aldridge himself retired from the Maple Grove Police Department in 2001, having never solved the case that he privately considered the single greatest failure of his entire career, and told a local reporter at his retirement dinner that he thought about Jennifer Hale nearly every single day, wondering what small detail his own department might have overlooked in those first critical weeks. He died in 2009, 2 years before Daniel Sorensen walked into Detective Voss's office, and his widow later said she wished more than almost anything else in her own long life that her husband could have lived just 2 more years to see the case he'd carried with him for nearly 2 decades finally reach its resolution. Carol retired from her bookkeeping job at the grain elevator in 2001, and neighbors said she spent much of the following decade tending an elaborate flower garden in her front yard, a project she described once, in an unguarded moment to a visiting reporter, as the only thing she'd found in the years since Jennifer's disappearance that reliably occupied her hands and her mind at the same time, sparing her from sitting too long with her own thoughts. Diane Whitmore, Jennifer's younger sister, moved back to the general region from Indianapolis in 1996, settling in a town 20 minutes from Maple Grove specifically, she later admitted, to be closer to her mother during a grief that showed no signs of lifting with time the way grief was supposed to. Diane never had children of her own, a choice she attributed, in later years, at least partly to the particular fear that had settled into her after her sister's disappearance, an inability to fully trust that the ordinary rhythms of daily life, walking to a car, attending a routine evening event, could be relied upon to remain safe. Tom Hale never remarried, moved out of the house on Birchwood Lane in 1998, unable to keep living in the rooms where he and Jennifer had once planned a nursery together, but stayed in Maple Grove itself, working the same electrician's trade for the rest of his career, a quiet, permanently altered presence at town events for the following 19 years. The husband everyone in Maple Grove still thought of, even after all that time, as the man whose wife had simply vanished one October night and never come home. Tom's brother Curtis, who had worked alongside him in the family electrical business since the beginning, later said that Tom essentially stopped attending Sunday family dinners for nearly 3 years after Jennifer disappeared, unable to sit at a table surrounded by the ordinary warmth of family life without being reminded, constantly, of everything he had lost. Curtis himself took on more of the responsibility for the family business during those years, quietly covering for his brother's grief without ever making Tom feel guilty about it. A kindness Tom later said he never properly thanked his brother for at the time, too consumed by his own pain to notice how much weight Curtis had simply absorbed without complaint. He kept a photograph of Jennifer on his workbench in the garage for the rest of his life, faded slightly by years of exposure to the fluorescent shop lights, a small, quiet fixture of his daily working life that his co-workers eventually simply stopped remarking on. Maple Grove Elementary hired a substitute teacher to finish out Jennifer's 5th grade class for the remainder of the 1992 school year, a kind but unfamiliar young woman named Miss Carpenter, who, by Danny Sorensen's own later recollection, spent the rest of that year doing her honest best in an impossible situation, teaching a room full of 10-year-olds who kept glancing at the classroom door every morning, some quiet part of each of them still expecting Mrs. Hale to walk back in and explain that the whole thing had been some strange misunderstanding. Miss Carpenter, only 23 years old herself, and fresh out of a teacher preparation program that had done absolutely nothing to prepare her for stepping into a classroom under these particular circumstances, later admitted in an interview given decades afterward that she had spent much of that spring simply trying to hold the room together, giving the children extra time for quiet reading, extra recess, extra small kindnesses, sensing without any formal training in childhood grief that structure and gentleness were probably the only tools she actually had. The class's end-of-year memory book that spring, an activity Miss Carpenter organized specifically because she felt the children needed some structured way to process the strangest, saddest year most of them had ever experienced, was where Danny Sorensen, prompted simply to write about a favorite memory or an important moment from the school year, wrote 6 sentences describing what he had seen through the gymnasium window on the night of parent-teacher night, a detail he had never once mentioned to any adult, not his father, not any teacher, not any of the police officers who briefly visited the school that fall to ask general questions of the older students, because it had never once occurred to 10-year-old Danny Sorensen that what he'd witnessed was anything more significant than a grown-up argument he happened to glimpse through a window while waiting for his dad. The police visit to the school that fall, in fact, had focused almost entirely on Jennifer's own 5th grade students, asking whether Mrs. Hale had seemed different lately, whether she'd mentioned any concerns, gentle, carefully worded questions designed for children who had been her direct students, a category that technically included Danny, though the specific question of whether he had personally witnessed anything on the night in question was never actually asked in those terms, and Danny, shy by nature, and still processing his own confused grief over a teacher he'd genuinely liked, never volunteered the detail unprompted. Danny's note, written in the careful, slightly uneven pencil handwriting of a 5th grader, read exactly as follows. The saddest thing that happened this year was when Mrs. Hale disappeared. The night before she disappeared, I saw her in the parking lot by the gym, talking to a man by a red truck. She looked upset. I don't know who he was. I never told anyone because I didn't think it mattered. I hope she comes back someday. Miss Carpenter, reading through the memory books before they were distributed to the students at the end of the year, saw Danny's entry, and by her own later account, felt a brief flicker of concern before ultimately deciding, as a 23-year-old substitute teacher with no experience in anything resembling a criminal investigation, that the detail was too vague and too second-hand to bother anyone with, especially since the school year was ending. The investigation appeared to have gone quiet, and she genuinely believed, in the moment, that a 10-year-old's memory of an unidentified man by an unidentified truck would add nothing meaningful to what she assumed the police had already thoroughly investigated. She mentioned it, in passing, to the school principal at an end-of-year staff meeting, and the principal, similarly unsure what to do with so vague a second-hand detail so many months after the fact, apparently never formally passed it along to the police department at all, a small, understandable, and ultimately devastating failure of communication that would take 19 years to correct. The memory books were distributed to the students in June of 1992, and Danny Sorensen's careful pencil account of the last confirmed sighting anyone would ever have of Jennifer Hale went home in a stack of comic books and school papers into a house on the edge of Maple Grove, where it would sit, unread and unexamined, for the next 19 years. Daniel Sorensen grew up in Maple Grove, graduated from Maple Grove High School in 2000, completed an electrician's apprenticeship, and built a quiet, ordinary adult life, largely within the same town where he'd grown up, working alongside his own father, for several years before eventually starting his own small contracting business. His father, Frank, had never remarried after the death of Daniel's mother, and the two had remained close throughout Daniel's adolescence and adulthood, a bond forged partly, Daniel always believed, by the shared habit of quiet self-reliance both men had developed out of necessity. Daniel rarely spoke, even to close friends, about the fact that he'd once been in Mrs. Hale's class the year she disappeared, a detail that had become, over the decades, simply one more piece of Maple Grove's collective, unspoken history, rather than something Daniel personally dwelt on. He married Melissa Chandler in 2008, a nurse he'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue, and the two settled into a modest house on the northern edge of Maple Grove, close enough to Daniel's father that Sunday dinners remained a fixture of their week. By 2011, he and Melissa were expecting their first child, a piece of news that had sent Daniel in the particular sentimental spiral that often overtakes soon-to-be fathers, digging through old boxes at his childhood home, searching for keepsakes worth passing down. His own father, Frank, by then in his early 60s, and preparing to downsize into a smaller house across town after years of managing the upkeep of a house too large for one person, had asked Daniel to come help clear out the garage that same weekend, and it was in a box labeled simply Danny's School Stuff, wedged between a stack of report cards and a deflated basketball, that Daniel found his 5th grade memory book for the first time in 19 years. Daniel sat on the cold concrete floor of his father's garage that afternoon and read his own 6 sentences 3 times before the full weight of what he was looking at actually settled into his chest. He had, in the intervening 19 years, thought about Jennifer Hale only rarely, in the vague, distant way people remember beloved figures from childhood who simply disappeared from their lives without explanation, and he had certainly never once, in all those years, consciously connected his own memory of that parking lot to anything resembling actual evidence. Sitting there in his father's garage, an adult now, with his own child on the way, Daniel found himself doing something he had never done as a 10-year-old, actually thinking carefully and specifically about what he had seen, about the timeline, about the fact that whoever that man by the red truck had been, he had apparently never been identified or investigated at all, because Daniel himself had never told anyone with the authority to do anything about it, and the one adult who had known, Miss Carpenter, had apparently let the details slip through the cracks of an already overwhelmed, understaffed small-town investigation. Frank Sorensen, when Daniel showed him the page and asked whether he remembered anything about that night, said only that he remembered picking Danny up from the hallway that evening and driving home exhausted after his own difficult conference, with no memory at all of any commotion in the parking lot, since his own attention that night had been focused entirely on his son's struggling grades and his own guilt over not being able to attend school events more regularly given his work schedule. Frank told Daniel he had no idea, all these years later, that his own son had witnessed something that might have mattered so much, and the two men sat together in the garage for a long while afterward, neither speaking, both absorbing the strange, delayed weight of what 19 years of silence had allowed to happen. Daniel called the Maple Grove Police Department the following Monday morning, and by that Wednesday, he found himself sitting across a desk from a detective he had never met, a woman in her mid-30s named Detective Rachel Voss, who had joined the department in 2003 and had, over the previous 2 years, taken on responsibility for reviewing the department's small handful of decades-old unsolved cases, Jennifer Hale's file chief among them, using investigative and forensic techniques that had simply not existed in 1992. Voss had grown up 2 counties away and had first learned about the Hale case as a rookie officer, paging through the department's small archive of unsolved files during a slow shift in her early years on the force, struck immediately by the sheer strangeness of a pregnant schoolteacher vanishing from a school parking lot in the middle of a town where, by every measure, almost nothing violent ever happened. She had, by her own later admission, returned to that particular file more times than any other over the years, rereading witness statements, cross-checking timelines, convinced that some detail buried in the original 1992 paperwork simply hadn't been given the weight it deserved, though she could never quite identify what that detail might be until Daniel Sorensen walked into her office 19 years later, holding a child's memory book. Voss listened to Daniel's account with the kind of careful, focused attention that told Daniel immediately he had done the right thing in coming forward, and asked him to repeat several specific details more than once: the exact position of the red truck relative to Jennifer's car, the approximate time he estimated the conversation took place, and whether he had noticed anything else at all about the man's appearance beyond his general build. She had him walk through the entire evening from the beginning, from arriving at the school with his father to the moment Wendell Price found him at the window, taking careful notes in the same deliberate handwriting, Daniel would later notice, with a strange little jolt, matched almost exactly the handwriting in his own old memory book, a small, unremarkable coincidence that nonetheless stuck with him for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. Daniel apologized, more than once, for not remembering more, for not having said something as a child, and Voss told him plainly that there was nothing to apologize for, that a 10-year-old boy waiting for his father had no reason in the world to understand the significance of what he was watching, and that the actual failure belonged entirely to the adults in 1992 who had received that same information secondhand and simply let it fall through the cracks of an overwhelmed investigation. Voss pulled the original 1992 case file that same week, and the detail that struck her immediately, cross-referencing Daniel's account against the old paperwork, was the timeline discrepancy buried in plain sight for 19 years. Roger Kessler's sign-out sheet had placed him leaving the building at 7:34. 2 co-workers had placed a phone call from him at 8:15 complaining about the conference. But Daniel Sorensen's account placed a man matching a general description, standing beside a red pickup truck, in direct conversation with Jennifer Hale sometime after 8 o'clock, based on Daniel's own recollection that the encounter took place not long before Wendell Price found him at the window to tell him his father had arrived for the 8:15 slot. If Daniel's timeline was accurate, someone had been in that parking lot with Jennifer, well after Roger Kessler's confirmed sign-out time and his confirmed phone call, which meant either an entirely different, unidentified man had also been present in that lot that night, or Roger Kessler's alibi contained a gap nobody in 1992 had ever thought to examine closely enough. Detective Voss drove to the small town in southern Illinois where Roger Kessler had relocated in 1999, following a second divorce and a job change, and requested a second interview, 19 years after the first. Kessler, now 61 years old and visibly unsettled to find a detective on his doorstep, asking about a case he clearly believed had been permanently closed on his end since 1992, initially repeated the same account he had given originally. He left the school angry at 7:34, drove straight home, and called his co-workers from his kitchen phone at 8:15 to vent about the conference. Voss asked him, directly, whether he owned a red pickup truck in 1992. Kessler confirmed that he had, a detail already noted in the original case file, but never connected meaningfully to anything, since his sign-out time had seemed to eliminate him as a suspect entirely regardless of what vehicle he drove. That first renewed interview ended without any real progress, Kessler growing defensive and eventually asking Voss to leave, insisting he had answered these same questions 19 years earlier and had nothing further to add. Voss returned 2 weeks later with a formal request, backed by the prosecutor's office, for a more detailed accounting of his whereabouts for the entire evening, rather than simply the 2 data points, the sign-out time and the phone call, that had satisfied investigators back in 1992. This second conversation grew tense enough that Kessler's daughter, who lived nearby and had accompanied him, partly out of concern about his blood pressure, asked Voss to leave as well, and Voss, sensing she was pushing at exactly the right pressure point, but lacking enough hard evidence yet to compel further cooperation, agreed to step back temporarily while continuing to build the case through other channels, requesting Kessler's old personnel and phone records from 1992 and cross-referencing the exact duration of the phone call his co-workers remembered against phone company billing records the department was, this time, able to formally subpoena. It was on Voss's third visit, nearly 2 months into the renewed investigation, after she had obtained and shown Kessler a copy of Daniel Sorensen's memory book page, that Kessler's composure finally broke. Voss later described watching something visibly collapse in the man's posture the moment he read the 6 sentences a 10-year-old boy had written nearly 2 decades earlier, as though some part of him had spent 19 years quietly braced for exactly this kind of evidence to eventually surface, and had simply run out of the energy required to keep denying what he had, on some level, always known might eventually come to light. He sat silently at his own kitchen table for almost a full minute, according to Voss's later account, before admitting that he had, in fact, returned to the school that night after signing out, driving back roughly 20 minutes after his initial departure, intending, in his own words, to find Jennifer Hale and demand a second conversation about his son, one where he felt he could make his case more calmly and be taken more seriously. He had waited near his truck in the side lot, he said, until Jennifer eventually came out to her own car sometime after 8 o'clock, having stayed later than expected, finishing her final conferences of the night, and had approached her exactly as Daniel Sorensen had described watching from the window. Kessler's account of what happened next given to Detective Voss over the course of several additional interviews conducted with his own attorney present, described an argument that escalated far beyond what either party had intended, Jennifer growing increasingly firm and unwilling to continue the conversation, Kessler growing increasingly agitated at what he perceived as being dismissed yet again, until, in a moment he described as a complete loss of control he had spent 19 years trying not to think about, he grabbed her arm to stop her from walking away, and Jennifer, 5 months pregnant and already unsteady on the uneven gravel surface at the edge of the lot, fell backward and struck her head against the open door frame of her own car. Kessler claimed, and no evidence ever definitively contradicted this specific portion of his account, that her death was not something he intended, that he panicked completely upon realizing she was not breathing, and that in a decision he called the single worst of his entire life, he loaded her body into the bed of his own truck rather than calling for help, drove to a construction site where he had done occasional side work for a local contractor, and buried her in a section of freshly graded earth that was scheduled to be built over with a small commercial warehouse within the following month, reasoning, in the cold calculation of his own panic, that the construction itself would ensure she was never found. Detective Voss, working with the county prosecutor's office, obtained a warrant to excavate the location Kessler eventually identified, now beneath the parking lot of a warehouse that had stood undisturbed for nearly 19 years, requiring specialized equipment simply to break through the layers of asphalt and gravel that had been added during the original construction. The warehouse itself, owned by a regional shipping company that had leased the building since 1994 with no knowledge whatsoever of what lay beneath its own parking lot, cooperated fully once the situation was explained, temporarily relocating its operations while the excavation proceeded. The company's general manager, when interviewed afterward, said the entire staff found it almost impossible to process the idea that they had been parking delivery trucks over the same ground for the better part of 2 decades without any of them ever suspecting a thing. The excavation, conducted over 4 difficult days in the fall of 2011, ultimately recovered skeletal remains consistent with Jennifer Hale, later confirmed through DNA comparison against samples provided by her mother, Carol Whitmore, and her surviving sister, Diane. The forensic anthropology team working the site, brought in from a regional university, worked with the same careful, painstaking methodology such recoveries always require, cataloging each fragment, each piece of evidence, with a slow deliberateness that Carol Whitmore, informed daily of the excavation's progress by Detective Voss, out of simple compassion, found almost unbearable to wait through, even though she understood intellectually why such care was necessary. The medical examiner's report, delivered to the Hale and Whitmore families in a private meeting 19 years and 11 days after Jennifer disappeared, confirmed what the entire town had feared and quietly known for nearly 2 decades, and included one additional detail that Carol Whitmore would later say broke something in her that had somehow, impossibly, remained whole through everything else. Preserved evidence consistent with a full-term or near-term pregnancy, confirming that the daughter Jennifer had been carrying, whom she and Tom had already decided to name Grace, had very likely been close to viable at the time of her mother's death. Roger Kessler was arrested and charged with the murder of Jennifer Hale in December of 2011, 19 years and 2 months after that parent-teacher night conference. He eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter in exchange for providing the exact location of the burial site and cooperating fully with the investigation, a plea deal that drew mixed reactions across Maple Grove, some residents feeling it represented too lenient an outcome for a crime that had stolen 19 years from an entire family, others acknowledging that without Kessler's cooperation, Jennifer and her unborn daughter might never have been found at all. The county prosecutor, explaining the plea agreement to a packed courtroom gallery, noted that after 19 years, physical evidence at the burial site itself had degraded enough that a conviction on the original murder charge, absent Kessler's own cooperation and admission, was far from guaranteed at trial, and that the certainty of a conviction, together with the recovery of Jennifer's remains, represented, in her professional judgment, the best achievable outcome for the family after so many years of uncertainty. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison in the spring of 2012, a sentence Carol Whitmore attended every single day of the proceedings for, sitting in the front row of the courtroom with her surviving daughter beside her, finally able, after 19 years, to look directly at the man responsible for the disappearance that had defined nearly 2 decades of her family's life. Carol was permitted to give a victim impact statement before sentencing, and she used it, in part, to speak directly to Danny, Kessler, Roger's now adult son, who sat in the courtroom gallery throughout the proceedings, telling him that she held no anger toward him, that he had been a struggling 10-year-old boy, just like Danny Sorensen had been, and that none of what his father had done was ever, in any way, his own burden to carry. Danny Kessler, whose struggling grades had inadvertently set the entire tragedy into motion, had grown up largely with his mother in Ohio after the divorce finalized, eventually did receive the learning evaluation Jennifer had originally recommended, was diagnosed with a specific reading disability, and went on, with appropriate support, to graduate high school and build a stable career as a machinist, entirely unaware for 19 years of what his father had actually done on the night of that difficult conference. Learning the truth as an adult in 2011 devastated him in ways he described, in a brief statement his attorney read on his behalf at the sentencing hearing, as impossible to fully put into words, caught between grief for a teacher he barely remembered and a complicated, unresolved anger toward the father who had, in his own telling, spent Danny's entire childhood insisting he had done everything he could for his son. Tom Hale, who had lived under a quiet cloud of unspoken suspicion in his own hometown for 19 years, despite having been formally cleared within the first month of the original investigation, was finally and completely vindicated by the resolution of the case, a vindication he described, in the one interview he agreed to give to a regional newspaper, as arriving far too late to undo 19 years of sidelong glances and whispered assumptions, but still somehow worth having. Tom told the reporter that the hardest part of those 19 years had never actually been the suspicion itself, which he had learned, slowly and painfully, to simply endure, but rather the quiet, particular loneliness of grieving a wife and a daughter, while an entire town watched him just closely enough to make him feel he could never fully grieve in peace, always slightly aware of being observed, evaluated, silently judged by neighbors who meant well but couldn't quite stop themselves from wondering. He attended Jennifer's second funeral, held in November of 2011, once her remains were finally released to the family, standing at the same small Maple Grove cemetery, where he had once imagined, in 1992, that he might eventually be buried beside his wife, after a long, ordinary shared life neither of them ever got to have. Nearly the entire town turned out for that second funeral, filling the small cemetery chapel well beyond capacity, many of them the same people who had quietly, unfairly suspected Tom for years, several of whom approached him afterward, some tearfully, to apologize directly for doubts they had once harbored, apologies Tom accepted with the same quiet grace he had carried through the entire ordeal. The headstone the family chose included, at Tom's specific request, Jennifer's name, her dates, and a smaller line beneath reading simply, "and her daughter, Grace, finally giving the unborn child a name and a place, 19 years after she had been carried, unnamed and unmarked, into the ground, alongside her mother. Carol Whitmore, standing at that graveside beside Tom, said afterward that watching him finally kneel and touch his hand to that new headstone was the single moment out of the entire 19-year ordeal that she would carry with her most clearly for the rest of her own life. Daniel Sorensen attended that funeral as well, standing near the back of the crowd with his own pregnant wife beside him, close enough to her due date by that point that Melissa had nearly stayed home rather than make the trip. A detail that struck Daniel, standing in that cemetery, with an unexpected and almost unbearable poignancy given everything he now knew about Jennifer's own unborn daughter. Afterward, Carol Whitmore sought him out specifically, having been told by Detective Voss exactly how the case had finally been cracked open after 19 years. She took both of Daniel's hands in hers, the same gesture, unknown to either of them, that grieving mothers in similar stories across the country had extended to the people who finally brought their children home, and thanked him for a memory he had carried, unknowingly, for nearly 2 decades, and for the courage it took, as a grown man with a family of his own, to sit down with an old memory book and actually read what his 10-year-old self had written instead of simply setting it aside. Carol asked Daniel, in that same conversation, whether he remembered anything else at all about Mrs. Hale from that year, any small detail from the classroom itself, and Daniel found himself telling her, somewhat to his own surprise, about a specific afternoon that spring when Jennifer had let the whole class feel her stomach when the baby kicked, how she had laughed at the collective gasp of 25 10-year-olds experiencing that small miracle together, how she had told them all, that same afternoon, that she hoped whichever one of them grew up to have their own children someday would remember exactly how that felt. Carol wept openly hearing this detail, one she had never known before, and told Daniel that of all the fragments of her daughter's final months that had come back to her over the previous several weeks, that particular memory, offered by a man she'd never met before that day, felt like the most precious gift anyone had given her in 19 years. Daniel told her only that he wished, more than anything, that he had understood what he was looking at the moment he wrote it, that a note meant as nothing more than a sad childhood memory had sat forgotten in a garage for 19 years, while an entire family waited for answers that had, in some sense, been available all along, tucked into a stack of comic books nobody thought to examine. Miss Carpenter, whose full name was Denise Carpenter, and who had gone on, after that single difficult year at Maple Grove Elementary, to build a long, respected teaching career of her own at a school district 2 hours away, learned of the case's resolution through a news alert on her phone in the fall of 2011, nearly 2 decades after she had briefly held, in her own hands, the one piece of evidence that could have solved the case decades earlier. Denise had, in fact, left teaching in small elementary schools shortly after that single traumatic year, moving instead into a middle school English position, a career shift she always attributed, when pressed by close friends, at least partly to a lingering unease about the fragility she'd witnessed in a room full of grieving 10-year-olds, an unease she never fully resolved even after 2 more decades in the classroom. She married in 1997, raised 2 children of her own, and had, by 2011, become a well-regarded department head at her middle school, respected by colleagues for exactly the kind of careful, attentive nature that made the memory of her own single lapse in 1992 all the more painful to revisit. She contacted Detective Voss directly upon learning the details, offering a full statement about her own role in failing to pass Danny Sorensen's note along to the police, an admission she made, according to Voss, with visible and lasting distress, repeating several times that she had been 23 years old and completely unequipped for the situation she'd been placed in, but that she had thought about that decision, in some form, nearly every year since, always wondering, in a vague, unresolved way, whether she had missed something important without ever being able to say exactly what. Voss told her, much as she had told Daniel Sorensen, that the failure belonged to an entire overwhelmed system rather than to any single well-meaning young teacher doing her best in an impossible situation, though Denise Carpenter later admitted to a mutual acquaintance that she doubted she would ever fully forgive herself, regardless of how kindly anyone else chose to frame it. The revelation drew significant regional and eventually national media attention throughout the winter of 2011 and into 2012, with several television news programs covering both the initial recovery of Jennifer Hale's remains and the subsequent guilty plea, most coverage focusing heavily on the almost unbelievable role played by a child's handwritten memory book entry, forgotten for 19 years in a garage box. A true crime television program produced a full hour-long episode on the case the following year, interviewing Carol Whitmore, Diane Whitmore, Detective Voss, and, with some reluctance, Daniel Sorensen himself, who agreed to participate specifically because Carol asked him to, believing the exposure might encourage other families to revisit old, seemingly insignificant pieces of evidence sitting forgotten in their own homes. Daniel insisted, as a condition of his participation, that any retelling include a direct message to viewers about checking old-school memory books, journals, and keepsakes for exactly this kind of forgotten detail, a condition the producers ultimately honored in the episode's closing segment. Tom Hale did not participate in any of the media coverage, preferring, according to his brother Curtis, to grieve and finally heal in relative privacy after 19 years of being a very public figure in his own small town's collective imagination. He did, however, send a private letter to Daniel Sorensen through Detective Voss, thanking him personally for what he had done, a letter Daniel kept folded in his own wallet for years afterward, a small private reminder of the strange, delayed weight of the whole experience. Melissa gave birth to their own daughter, a healthy girl they named Grace Marie, 6 weeks after the trial concluded, a name Daniel and Melissa had chosen together well before the proceedings began, though Daniel would later admit, quietly, to only 1 or 2 close friends, that some part of the decision had undoubtedly been shaped by everything he'd learned that year about the daughter Jennifer Hale never got the chance to raise. Maple Grove Elementary still keeps a small memorial plaque near the front entrance of the school, installed shortly after Jennifer's remains were finally identified in 2011, bearing her name, her years of service, and a simple line chosen by her former students, now grown adults with children of their own. She never stopped believing in us, and we never stopped believing she would come home. The plaque was unveiled at a ceremony held the following spring, attended by dozens of Jennifer's former students, many of them now well into their 30s, several of whom, like Daniel, brought their own young children to see the dedication of a memorial for a teacher those children would never have the chance to meet. Carol Whitmore spoke briefly at that ceremony, thanking the community for 19 years of unwavering support, and thanking, by name, a grown man who had once been a quiet, self-sufficient 10-year-old boy sitting on a hallway bench for finally giving her family the answer they had waited 2 decades to receive. The annual memory book activity, the same simple end-of-year exercise that had once, entirely by accident, preserved the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, continues at the school to this day, though teachers now, quietly and without ever explaining exactly why, read every single page a little more carefully than they might have in 1992. The current principal of Maple Grove Elementary, who took the position in 2015 with no direct personal connection to the case, beyond having grown up in a neighboring county and having heard the story the way most people eventually do, told a visiting reporter for the 10th anniversary of the case's resolution that the school now includes as a permanent part of teacher training, a brief discussion of the Hale case specifically to remind new staff never to dismiss a child's account of something witnessed, however vague or second-hand it might initially seem. Detective Rachel Voss was formally commended by the Maple Grove Police Department for her work reopening and ultimately solving the case, and has since been asked to speak at several regional law enforcement training sessions about the particular challenges of cold case investigation in small, resource-limited departments. She has always insisted, in every interview and every training session she has led since, that the true credit belongs entirely to a grown man's willingness to take a childhood memory seriously 19 years after the fact, and to a mother, Carol Whitmore, whose refusal to ever fully let the case go quiet kept the file active enough in the department's own internal priorities that someone was still paying attention when Daniel Sorensen finally walked through the door. Diane Whitmore, Jennifer's sister, sat through every day of Roger Kessler's sentencing hearing beside her mother and gave her own brief statement before the sentence was handed down, telling the courtroom that she had spent 19 years unable to fully answer her own young children's eventual question, the one she knew she would someday face, of what had happened to their Aunt Jennifer, and that she was grateful, finally, to have an honest answer to give them rather than the same unbearable uncertainty she herself had lived with for 2 decades. Diane had, in the years since, become an occasional public speaker herself, appearing alongside her mother at a handful of victim advocacy events across Indiana, always emphasizing the same central point that had come to define both women's understanding of what had finally solved the case. That persistence, however unglamorous and however many dead ends it produces, matters, and that the department's willingness to keep the file technically open for 19 years, even through long stretches with no active leads at all, was precisely what allowed Daniel Sorensen's memory book to matter the moment it finally surfaced. Maple Grove, Indiana remembers Jennifer Hale differently now than it did for the 19 years she was simply gone. The story is no longer told as a warning about strangers lurking in school parking lots, since the man responsible had never been a stranger at all, but as a story about how completely ordinary anger, left unchecked in a single overwhelmed moment, can end an entire life and reshape a family for 2 decades, and about how the smallest, most overlooked pieces of evidence, a child's memory book entry dismissed as too vague to matter, can sit quietly for 19 years, waiting for someone to finally take them seriously. If there is one thing worth carrying away from Jennifer Hale's story, it might be this. Somewhere in this country right now, there is very likely another memory book, another old notebook, another forgotten page filled with a child's careful, uneven handwriting, describing something that seemed unimportant at the time, but was in fact the missing piece an entire investigation needed all along. Children notice far more than the adults around them tend to realize, and they rarely understand, in the moment, that what they've seen matters at all. If you were ever a child who witnessed something strange and never knew what to do with it, or if you are a parent, a teacher, or simply someone clearing out an old box of childhood keepsakes, it costs nothing to look one more time, to read the whole page instead of skimming past it, to ask the question again before deciding something is truly nothing. Jennifer Hale and her daughter came home 19 years late, but they came home, and it took nothing more dramatic, in the end, than a grown man finally sitting down to read 6 sentences he had written when he was 10 years old, and had no idea, at the time, that he was writing down the truth. Carol Whitmore says it simply whenever she is asked what she hopes people take from her daughter's story. Read the whole page, she tells them. You never know whose truth is sitting right there in front of you.